Hello and welcome back to this damn fully delisted crusade. This video is all about what I think is one of the greatest soundtracks of all time for one of the greatest films of all time, and certainly one of my all-time favorite soundtracks, which is Wang Chung's incredible score for To Live and Die in LA. This is one of the scores that goes so hand in hand with the film that both film and score are practically fused together. And it was also interestingly brought about because William Friedkin himself, the director of the film, actually sought out Wang Chung to actually compose the score because I think he had primarily sort of caught on to their music and was listening to it while he was developing the script adaptation from the original novel. And so that's why it's also important to look at the band's Points on the Curve album, which was just before this point and what Friedkin was listening to, and also two of the songs on here were actually used in the film, although only one of them is included on the soundtrack itself. Now, by this point, Wang Chung was down to just a two-man act between Nick Feldman and Jack Hughes, but what they managed to do in terms of both the instrumental tracks and the actual full songs with vocal tracks, and the soundtrack is rather fascinatingly split between the vocal tracks on one side and the actual instrumentals on the second side. The score for To Live and Die in LA has been described as some as being off-putting or extremely 80s and synth-driven and so on and so forth. But that's kind of the point. I think the film is the definitive 1980s film in terms of the film that most gets across the whole feeling of the decade and the shift in society, and not just in how media was presented and corporations were taking over studios more and more, but also the darker elements of American society and the human condition that were shifting around. It is, I think, the greatest time capsule of the 1980s, and it's not afraid to get into the underbelly of society, which is why I think the film is not only beyond striking and a masterpiece, but for me, it's William Friedkin's masterpiece. And as much as I adore The French Connection and his other great films, it's To Live and Die in LA that remains, I think, his career-defining achievement. And also, I think it's one of the greatest films ever made and the definitive film of the 1980s. So it's fitting that it has one of the most, if not the most definitive 1980s sounding score in what Wang Chung created. But I think they very much were able to go beyond what even Friedkin expected from them. Friedkin even wrote the liner notes on the back of the album soundtrack release. I would also discuss how he specifically wanted the score to highlight each individual moment of the various characters and the character arcs that the film displays, but also how he wanted the music to reflect certain aspects of the LA culture in the mid-1980s and certain aspects of the city and different areas that not everybody always got into, how he wanted the music to feel visceral and alive. But also he stipulated he didn't want a title song, and Wang Chung was able to fulfill everything that Friedkin was looking for and go beyond that. And of course, they did actually manage to come up with a song titled To Live and Die in LA, and it's so fantastic, and Friedkin was so blown away that he redesigned the entire opening of the film to focus on and highlight and utilize the title song to its fullest extent, and it's a perfect means to get into the world of the film. But the score is a phenomenal listen on its own. You hear it and you can't not think of the film. They're so unified, as it's such a complete experience in terms of feel and tone and grittiness and darkness, but also it's a fantastic album in its own right. I think it's easily the band's best album, and I've always hated the fact that they didn't stay in this vein and eventually switched over to the style they're most known for today, which you hear in their biggest song, Everybody Have Fun Tonight, which was on the Mosaic album. And their later albums are all interesting and good. I also have The Other Side of Cool on the LP version, and both it and Mosaic are well-mastered, nice vinyl releases. But they never again returned to the harder edged style and the just the incredibly impactful elements they brought together for the To Live and Die in LA score, which again was released as the soundtrack album and I think is their masterpiece. It does build on elements that are in Points on the Curb, so I think this album goes very much hand in hand with the soundtrack, because it was this album that really brought them to the attention of Friedkin, and also the two major songs from this album were incorporated into the film. Of course, Dance Hall Days is probably their second most known song, and I think another of their masterworks. I think it's one of the great singles of the 80s, but that was incorporated into the film, and then the track Wait was actually used as the end title in the film, and it is on the actual soundtrack, but Dance Hall Days is not, so that's a good reason to have Points on the Curve, which is also a great album from this era and a nice vinyl mastering that is very inexpensive. But you can also go the route of having one of the promo singles, or having the nice extended 12-inch mix version on the 12-inch single. You can't tell I'm obsessed with this film and this score, can you? Speaking of obsessed with the score, I have 3 copies of the original vinyl release. I can't help myself, especially when I find really nice promo stamped copies that are in perfect shape for $1. I have an obsession with this film and this score, if you really can't tell. Now, as for the actual soundtrack release, it was done on both vinyl and cassette in 1985 to tie into the film, and did achieve a good level of success, though not exactly chart-topping, although the actual title song did do pretty decently. Now, of course, here is the soundtrack release, which of course I have multiple copies of. It is a common album to find, and it's long been on my cheap, inexpensive, great albums with great vinyl pressings, or original pressings, I should say, short list. So I think it's a record that everybody should have in terms of great albums you can get for dirt cheap with really great pressings. But of course, it has a still from the opening title sequence and has the film font and then the band's name nicely put in here. So it does have a unique sort of cover image of its own that very much befits the film. This, of course, is another promotional copy. I absolutely am a sucker for minty promo copies, and I try to get a promo copy whenever I can. The rear, of course, continues the theme, and I like that they kept the sunset theme on the back as well. Here in the corner are the liner notes by Friedkin I previously mentioned, so this gives you the background of how he selected Wang Chung to compose the score, but how they went even beyond his expectations, and that he also claims the album itself is legitimately great on its own, which it is, because it's a great album. But also you can see again how the sides are split, so all of the vocals, the actual songs with vocals, are all on side 1, and then side 2 has the instrumentals, starting off with the nearly 10-minute epic City of the Angels, which is used in the opening and the counterfeiting sequence, and also in little pieces throughout the film. Now, that's another note about how the score and the film go hand in hand. If you watch the film and you pay attention to the actual score, there are 1 or 2 very minor pieces of just like a little tiny fleeting bit of source music and a spot or 2 that are not Wang Chung pieces or pre-existing pieces by the band. But everything else is either the Wang Chung score, or, again, the song Wait is used on the end titles, and then Dance Hall Days is used as source music, I think rather brilliantly, in the scene where William Peterson as Chance goes in to the strip club in the wee early hours of the morning, which is such a sort of wonderfully miserable idea of going to that sort of seedy strip club in broad daylight in the morning to get information on somebody, and the way that song is used to underline the emotion of the scene, the characters in that moment, and the nature of what is not being spoken, the nuances between the dialogue. It's just a such a visceral, complete moment, topped up by Robbie Mueller's incredible cinematography and the usage of the intensely deep lighting of that scene, of the contrasting deep red and deep greens of the lighting. So that's just a great example of how images, characterization, direction, and score and just setting, how it all combines into a real complete moment that's been carved out in time. And the film is entirely moments like that, which is, again, why I think it's an absolute masterpiece and one of the greatest films ever made. But Friedkin was able to actually take all the new score pieces, again, outside of the two pre-existing songs he used, and actually take pieces of them. He doesn't use entire tracks. So Wang Chung created entire cues and pieces, which you can hear in their entirety on the soundtrack, but Friedkin doesn't just drop them in. He's able to take pieces of them and use them as character motifs and themes for certain moments or at certain points in the character arcs, or when things take a real dark turn at many different elements, or when the story upends itself. He's able to take pieces of the Wang Chung cues and pepper them and spread them all over the film so that it creates a sense of unification, and it gives you a world sense of the story in musical terms. So it makes the incredible soundtrack that Wang Chung created even more effective, because Friedkin is able to use it throughout the entirety of the film and not just have individual cues. He's able to break it up. That's why City of the Angels is, again, almost 10 minutes long, but he's able to take pieces and sections of it and use it to their most effective potential in those moments. And then when we return to it, it's like a classical score having themes and cues and motifs that run throughout. So I think that's another element that a lot of people overlook in terms of the film is so brilliantly edited and also so brilliantly put together in its original sound design. It's a very intricately made film. But the score is done in a way that it's just like a classical film score. There are motifs, there are themes that run throughout, and it's so cohesive that Friedkin was able to take individual pieces and sections of the cues and use them throughout the entirety of the film, so that the musical score is just as focused and complete and total a worldview as the actual visuals of the film. And the score thus works with the visuals hand in hand. The film is a complete experience. The score is a complete experience, but when combined, it's absolutely hypnotic. And that's why I think the film has always been unforgettable. But I do think the score is still severely underrated and is not quite respected in the way that it should be. And I also think it's the band's best album. I just wish they had kind of worked more in a similar vein after this point. Again, their next two albums are good, but I just always wish they had done something that was a bit more like this soundtrack, which I think is also their best album. And it's one of the few examples of a band coming in and doing the soundtrack for a film and then also releasing it as their own album. So it has a foot in either territory. It's a soundtrack, but it's also a band album. And so it's one of those, like, say, Queen's Flash Gordon, that also it has a foot in either camp. Now, in terms of the actual pressing and the mastering and the releases and such, again, it did receive vinyl and cassette releases in 1985, which were the formats of the time. It did eventually get a CD a little later, I think in about 1988 or so. And honestly, I've never actually gotten the score on the CD. I've meant to, but the actual original vinyl pressing is so good and so well mastered and so easily available and cheap and also easy to find in really good condition that I really didn't have the need to. And again, I now have 3 copies of the vinyl soundtrack. This was when the band had been signed to Geffen, who released the Points on the Curve album here. And so you can find these in really nice shape. Of course, it has the classic looking Geffen Records black label. And what's great about this, it was mastered at Artisan by Greg Fulginiti, who also mastered Points on the Curve and many great records of this time period. So this is a fantastic pressing. The score sounds incredible and also has a better and more fuller range to it compared to the film mix, because the film was mixed in Dolby Stereo, which was a matrix process, and anytime you have a soundtrack being incorporated back into a film mix, it's going to take a hit in fidelity and not quite sound as good as the actual soundtrack master itself. So you do get a nice fidelity boost going to the actual soundtrack. So if you've never actually listened to the album itself and you love the film, this is an absolute must. Plus, you get to hear the band's cues in their entirety in terms of the tracks, and you get the fascinating sort of difference between all the vocal tracks on one side and then all of the instrumental tracks on the other side. And again, getting to hear City of the Angels in its entirety is phenomenal. Again, this is a fantastically mastered piece of vinyl. I think this is one of the essential records to pick up if you have a turntable. It was brilliantly mastered by Greg Fulginiti, who's one of the great engineers of this era. Again, mastered at Artisan, so it's got their classic sort of logo with the circles and drumsticks in it, and makes a great companion piece to have with Points on the Curve as well. So I think it's really essential to have both of these albums, which are very affordable. You can find them in most any store in nice condition, both with the same great mastering engineer. Both sound fantastic. Plus, if you get Points on the Curve, that will also get you a copy of Dance Hall Days, which is unfortunately not included on the soundtrack. And then you get to hear both Dance Hall Days and Wait in their original context within the actual Points on the Curve album, which again is also a great album. And I think these are the two best albums of the band's discography, which isn't the biggest discography, but I think they always get sort of written off as an 80s act or 80s has-beens, which I think is unfair because they were really sort of pushing boundaries in terms of genres. And also, this is a really good album. But To Live and Die in LA is not only one of the great soundtracks, but I think it's also one of the great albums of the 80s. So I just wanted to put together something on one of my all-time favorite soundtracks that I think is so brilliant that it enhances what I think is one of the greatest films ever made, and is so fully unified into that film that you can't think of the film without the score, and you can't think of the score without the film. But the score itself is a brilliant album in its own right. It's, I think, the band's masterpiece. I think it's one of the best albums of the 80s, and it's got a fantastic vinyl pressing in terms of the original 1985 pressing that you can find for just a couple bucks in most any record store, and it's just a brilliant mastering job that I think is essential for any record collection. Again, the original CD also came out a little bit later and should still have the same full dynamics maintained. There was a CD reissue in about 1996 or so, although it's possible that did have some dynamic range reduction because that was already in vogue at the time. I've just never actually gotten to listen to that pressing. And then in about 2015, Capitol did a vinyl reissue randomly that I've seen a couple times. That was a new mastering job, but if it's anything like the other Capitol vinyl reissues of that time, it probably wasn't pressed very well and was probably cut from a digital master, and again, it would be digital cut vinyl, but that is floating around, but that's really the only reissue the score has had. There's never been a full deluxe boutique soundtrack label release, which I would absolutely love to see at some point, especially if it was, say, La La Land Records or Entrada or somebody like that who could, go to town and include any extras. There are a number of alternate versions and mixes of some of the songs. Unfortunately, a lot of them were only released as European singles, so I would like to someday get, say, the British 12 inches of To Live and Die in LA or Wait, for example. So there are some alternative mixes floating around of some of the tracks and some remixes and such, and those could be included on a deluxe boutique label soundtrack release. And I definitely think this score merits it because, again, I think it's one of the great soundtracks of all time, and I think it's one of the best albums of the 80s in terms of just as a standalone album and listening experience. So I hope you've enjoyed even more of my never-ending babbles about the genius and majestic greatness of To Live and Die in LA as a film, but also Wang Chung's incredible score, which I think is their masterpiece, and also various releases and pressings, of which I think the original 1985 vinyl release is a fantastic release, and I think essential for any record collection, as it sounds fantastic. It was mastered perfectly, and especially if you have a good turntable setup, is just a fantastic piece of vinyl to have, and is also incredibly common and very inexpensive. So it's always been part of my cheap, inexpensive, great pressings list of vinyl titles. So as always, please do keep supporting studio labels, boutique labels, and soundtrack labels by buying films and their soundtracks on on physical media releases to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. Please continue to support your local independent record stores by, if you're looking for a copy of the album or this video encourages you, hopefully you're able to pick up a copy of the incredible masterpiece score for To Live and Die in LA by Chung on the original vinyl release, and also support your local record store and help keep them in business. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.